A humble maid is wrongly accused of stealing her millionaire boss's watch. But in court the truth comes out when the maid's son faces the powerful and exposes the fraud that almost destroyed his mother. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel now to help us continue impacting lives. Mariana always believed that hard work and honesty were enough to earn respect. For over 10 years, she served the Vasconcelos family, cleaning every corner of the mansion, preparing meals, and attending to every detail with dedication. Ricardo, the millionaire head of the household, seemed to trust her, but the truth is that the one who truly ran everything was his wife, Helena, an elegant, powerful woman accustomed to controlling the family's image in society. Mariana never dared to challenge any order, even when she was treated coldly or given disdainful looks. Even so, deep within her, she found solace. Gabriel, her 12-year-old son, who reminded her every day that life had meaning. On a seemingly ordinary morning, the routine was shattered by a whisper that spread through the mansion's corridors like wildfire. Ricardo's Swiss watch, valued at millions, had disappeared. Helena didn't hesitate. With a firm voice and icy eyes, she declared before everyone that the only suspect was Mariana. After all, who else would have access to the room, the drawers, that valuable object? The news spread through the house in seconds, and the previously indifferent gazes became heavy, suspicious, as if Mariana had become a criminal overnight. Ricardo, pressured by his wife's categorical tone, didn't defend Mariana. Instead, he allowed himself to be swayed by Helena's harsh words, as she was already articulating the case beyond the mansion's walls. Soon, neighbors, journalists, and onlookers learned of the accusation. Local headlines appeared with phrases like, "Maid betrays millionaire's trust," and "Scandalous robbery shakes Vasconcelos family." Mariana was taken to the police station as if she were a dangerous criminal. Humiliated, without money to pay for a lawyer, she found herself alone before a system that seemed to have already chosen her fate. What Mariana didn't know was that, away from the watchful eyes of the media and Helena's overwhelming power, Gabriel was silently keeping something that could change everything, a secret that, at the right moment, would have the power to turn the tide in court. Mariana spent that night awake, sitting in the small living room of her simple house, staring at the floor as if searching for answers amid the cracks in the floorboards. The memory of the police station still burned in her mind. The cold stares of the officers, the whispers of the neighbors who saw her being taken away, the feeling of being branded guilty before she could even speak. She had never been involved in anything wrong, but now she was plastered across the newspapers as the woman who robbed her own boss. Every heartbeat was accompanied by growing anguish, for Mariana knew she had no money, no influential allies, and no voice against the powerful Helena. The humiliation was so great that she wondered if she could face the coming days. But when she looked into Gabriel's room and saw her son sleeping, a mother's love gave her the strength to bear the weight of the world. Across town, Helena was already planning her next steps. Sitting before the mansion's fireplace, a glass of wine in hand, and the impeccable posture of someone in control, she spoke on the phone with influential journalists, shaping the headlines before the trial even began. Her goal wasn't just to accuse Mariana, it was to destroy her completely. Beside her, Ricardo remained silent, torn between doubt and obedience. He remembered Mariana's years of honest work, but pressure from his wife and fear of scandal kept him paralyzed. With each call from Helena, Mariana's image as the trusted criminal was reinforced. More than a clock, the Vasconcelos family's pride was at stake, and Helena would not accept any threat to that reputation. To her, Mariana was merely a disposable piece, to be crushed without guilt. Meanwhile, Gabriel sensed the weight his mother carried, even though she tried to hide it. At school, he heard classmates repeating the headlines, mocking the millionaire's thief. He came home teary-eyed, hugged Mariana tightly, and told her he knew she was innocent. That simple phrase was the only relief she had amidst the chaos. But Gabriel carried more than support. He held a memory he couldn't forget. The night the watch disappeared, he had seen something that didn't match Helena's version, a small detail, but one that could dismantle the entire accusation. Mariana didn't know it yet, and Gabriel feared no one would believe a 12-year-old boy. Even so, every time he heard his mother sobbing softly in the wee hours of the morning, the courage grew within him to, at the right moment, open his mouth and reveal what he had seen. The court day arrived faster than Mariana would have liked. She woke early, her eyes puffy from so many sleepless nights, and dressed in her simplest clothes, the same ones she wore to work. It was all she had. She walked the streets with her head down, feeling the heavy gazes of the people, as if each one was already certain of her guilt. Upon entering the courthouse, reality hit her hard. Journalists crowded the entrance, cameras pointed at her, flashbulbs popping as if she were a celebrity in the scandal. Mariana took a deep breath, trying not to cry in front of the crowd. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even more cruel. On one side, Helena, impeccable in an elegant dress, sat with one of the city's most expensive lawyers, exuding confidence. On the other, Mariana, alone, clutching an envelope with a few old letters of recommendation that barely seemed important compared to the apparatus assembled by the Vasconcelos family. The judge entered, and silence fell over the room. The lawyer Helena hired stood first, walking to the center with firm steps. His voice sounded like hammer blows as he described Mariana as ungrateful, opportunistic, and self-serving. He showed photos of the missing watch, recalled her access to the house, and painted a picture of domestic betrayal that drew murmurs from the audience. Mariana tried to remain calm, but with each word, the ground seemed to sink deeper beneath her feet. Ricardo was there, sitting next to his wife, but he wasn't looking at her. His eyes stared blankly, as if trying to ignore the scene. Mariana wanted to scream, wanted to defend herself, but when her turn came, her voice trembled. She spoke of her years of dedication, of her love for her work, of how she never took anything from anyone. He spoke sincerely, but he saw a sharp indifference on the faces around him. At the back of the room, Gabriel watched in silence, his heart aching. He shouldn't have been there, but he managed to enter accompanied by a neighbor who was moved by the family's pain. He looked at his mother with tearful eyes, powerless in the face of the injustice unfolding before him. Inside him, however, a flame grew. He clearly remembered what he had seen that night. Helena's figure rummaging through the safe, holding something shiny before hurriedly closing it. Gabriel had never told anyone this, afraid they wouldn't believe him. But now, watching her mother being crushed, she felt she could no longer remain silent. Her hands trembled, but her desire for justice was stronger. The moment Helena's lawyer smiled, certain that victory was near, Gabriel slowly rose to his feet, walking to the central aisle of the room, and opened his mouth to speak. When Gabriel stood up, everyone in the room seemed uncomfortable with the audacity of a boy interrupting the trial. The judge frowned, journalists began to whisper, and Helena turned her face away with an icy look that, alone, seemed to silence the boy. But Gabriel didn't back down. He approached the center, his eyes watering and his voice still hesitant, and said he had something important to reveal. Silence fell over the room. Mariana, surprised, tried to stand up to stop her son from going through that, but she was paralyzed by the courage she saw before her. Heart racing, Gabriel declared that, on the night the watch disappeared. He woke to drink water and saw Helena inside Ricardo's office, holding something shiny in her hands before hastily putting it in a safe. That memory echoed through the room like a thunderbolt. Helena's lawyer reacted immediately, standing up and saying it was just a child's imagination, that childhood memories were confusing and easily manipulated. He tried to ridicule the boy, calling him emotional and vulnerable, unable to understand what had really happened that night. But Gabriel, with unexpected strength for his age, didn't back down. He described the safe in detail, the dark wood, the gold lock, and even the small scratch on the corner of the lid, something only someone who had actually seen it could know. People in the courtroom began exchanging glances. Some journalists were already frantically taking notes, and even the judge leaned forward, interested in the boy's accuracy. Mariana wept silently, not out of sadness, but out of pride. For the first time since the tragedy began, someone was speaking the truth out loud, and that someone was her own son. Helena, for her part, momentarily lost control of her impeccable expression. Her haughty smile gave way to a slight tremor in her lips. She looked at Ricardo, who looked away, unable to bear the scene. In a desperate act, Helena said aloud that the boy was confused, that he had dreamed, and that Mariana had instructed him to lie to try to escape guilt. But the words no longer carried the same weight. The audience in the room seemed less convinced, and the security that had previously surrounded the Vasconcelos family began to crack. The judge, realizing the gravity of the situation, interrupted the session and ordered an immediate investigation into Gabriel's statements. A murmur filled the room, and Helena, for the first time, was seen without her air of unshakable authority, just a woman cornered by a truth that threatened to explode at any second. The judge's order to immediately investigate fell like a bombshell in the courtroom. Police officers were instructed to go to the Vasconcelos mansion and check the safe Gabriel had described. As the session was temporarily suspended, journalists rushed out of the courtroom, spreading the news of the unexpected testimony. Mariana remained seated, still in shock, her hands trembling, while Gabriel snuggled beside her, trying to find strength in his mother's embrace. She looked into her son's eyes and realized the courage he had shown, courage many adults lack. Meanwhile, Ricardo remained motionless, his face filled with doubt, torn between his fidelity to his wife and the crushing weight of the truth that was beginning to dawn on everyone. Helena, on the other hand, paced back and forth like a cornered lioness, trying to maintain her composure but clearly disturbed by the possibility that the safe secret would be discovered. Hours later, investigators returned carrying a small, dark wooden box with a gold lock, exactly as Gabriel had described. The safe was placed on the courtroom table and, before everyone's watchful eyes, slowly opened. Inside, wrapped in a velvet cloth, was the missing Swiss watch. A murmur rippled through the room, and reporters stood up as if in disbelief. The judge raised his eyebrows, surprised by the boy's accuracy. Mariana covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face, while Gabriel smiled shyly, relieved to finally be heard. Helena's lawyer tried to protest, saying it meant nothing, that it could just be a misunderstanding, but his voice sounded increasingly fragile in the face of concrete evidence. Helena's mask of control was beginning to shatter before everyone's eyes. The judge resumed the session and announced that the discovery completely changed the course of the case. Mariana was no longer just the defenseless accused. Now she appeared as the victim of a cruel setup. Helena, in despair, stood up and tried to justify herself, saying that the watch had been stored there by mistake, that it was all just a mix-up. But no one seemed to believe her words. The audience, previously indifferent or even hostile to Mariana, now looked at her with compassion and surprise. Ricardo, pressed by the weight of the evidence, finally looked up at his wife, visibly shaken. Gabriel clutched his mother's hand tightly, as if silently saying that the worst was over. But everyone knew this was only the beginning. The safe had revealed the jewel of the scandal, but it also hid other secrets that could be even more devastating for the Vasconcelos family. When the watch was removed from the safe and displayed before everyone, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. But the judge ordered absolute silence and asked investigators to examine the rest of the contents. Inside the small box were not only the Swiss watch, but also several envelopes filled with cash and mysterious documents with signatures and dates that seemed to indicate obscure financial transactions. The revelation further heightened the tension. Helena's lawyer tried to block the inspection, claiming the papers were unrelated to the case, but the judge interrupted him and ordered everything entered into evidence. Mariana watched in silence, her breath quickening, while Gabriel, still beside her, stared intently at the safe, as if his memory were being confirmed before everyone's eyes. Helena, for the first time since the trial began, completely lost control. She tried to stand, demanding that they stop searching her belongings, claiming it was an invasion of privacy. But her voice no longer held the same strength as before. Journalists leaned over the tables to note every detail. Cameras captured every movement, and the audience seemed mesmerized by the slow fall of the woman who had always displayed so much power. Ricardo, seated, covered part of his face with his hands. He seemed to finally realize the depth of the lie he had supported for weeks. That safe not only exonerated Mariana, but also revealed that there was much more behind Helena's manipulations. A castle of secrets built over the years was beginning to crumble before everyone's eyes. The judge firmly declared that the case needed to be re-evaluated immediately, opening new investigations not only into the alleged theft, but also into Helena's conduct. With each word, the weight of the truth crushed the perfect image she had maintained for so long. Mariana, overcome with emotion, didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She finally felt heard, but at the same time frightened by the enormity of the farce she had been implicated in. Gabriel squeezed his mother's hand, proud to have spoken, but also aware that the fight was not yet over. Silence hung over the courtroom when, suddenly, one of the investigators held up one of the documents found in the safe and announced that this could change not only Mariana's case, but the Vasconcelos' entire reputation. The investigator held up the document before everyone and explained that it contained bank records and proof of transfers made to offshore accounts. The documents were in the name of shell companies, but signed by Helena Vasconcelos. The revelation fell like a thunderclap in the courtroom. This wasn't just related to the missing watch, but also pointed to a possible scheme of embezzlement and concealment of assets. The journalists, who had previously only discussed domestic burglary, now saw a potential financial scandal unfolding. Mariana, perplexed, looked at the judge and then at her son, as if in disbelief at the turn of events. The accusation that had nearly destroyed her life was turning into something much bigger: the public exposure of Helena's true colors. Helena, pale, still tried to defend herself. She said the documents were old, unrelated to her, and that anyone could have put them in the safe to incriminate her. But her words rang hollow. The audience murmured louder and louder, and Ricardo himself seemed unable to find the strength to intervene. He lowered his head, avoiding looking at his wife, perhaps because he knew deep down that these movements were nothing new. For years, he had trusted Helena blindly, allowing her to manage the finances and make all the decisions, and now he realized that his loyalty had made him a silent accomplice to shady practices. The judge called for calm, but the atmosphere in the courtroom was one of disbelief and tension. The case of the wronged maid was taking on the appearance of a national scandal. Mariana, even though frightened, felt something different within herself: dignity. For the first time since the beginning, it wasn't she who cowered in the face of the accusations, but Helena who felt cornered. The judge suspended the session for a more in-depth review of the documents, but before closing, he made it clear that the evidence completely changed the nature of the trial. Mariana wept silently, while Gabriel rested his head on her shoulder, relieved to have told the truth. But everyone knew this wasn't the end. The pages of documents still hid secrets that could put not only Helena, but the entire Vasconcelos family at risk. The noise of the cameras, the incessant flashes, and the whispers from the audience made it clear. What had once been a domestic affair was now about to become a devastating revelation capable of toppling an empire. Upon resuming the session, the judge ordered the documents read aloud in front of everyone, so there would be no doubt about their contents. The pages revealed large deposits in unknown accounts, properties registered in third parties' names, and even contracts signed with non-existent companies. Every detail seemed carefully constructed to conceal funds that had clearly not been officially declared. Mariana listened in silence, unable to believe that all of this was hidden within the house where she had worked for so many years. The public, previously eager to point the finger at the maid, now turned against Helena. The powerful Mrs. Vasconcelos, once so haughty, was slowly becoming the villain in a scandal that extended beyond the courtroom. Ricardo, sitting beside his wife, seemed increasingly distressed. His hands trembled in his lap, and sweat trickled down his forehead. At times, he closed his eyes as if trying to deny reality. But the documents were too clear to ignore. The signatures were Helena's, the dates were recent, and the amounts moved were too high to be dismissed as mere administrative errors. Journalists whispered among themselves, preparing headlines that would no longer focus solely on Mariana, but on a possible financial scheme involving Helena and, consequently, the Vasconcelos family itself. Mariana watched everything, almost in disbelief, and noted Gabriel's expression, a mixture of relief and courage, as if the boy were certain the truth was finally coming to light. Helena, realizing she was losing ground, stood up nervously and tried to turn the tables. She pointed at Mariana and said firmly that it was all part of a trap, that the maid had always been jealous of the family and was now even manipulating her own son to tarnish their image. The speech, however, failed to have the desired effect. People no longer saw Mariana as the criminal, but as a victim of cruel abuse. The judge firmly interrupted Helena and declared that new accusations of manipulation would be investigated. Ricardo looked at her, this time without looking away, and what was visible in his eyes was not support, but deep disappointment. The silence in the courtroom was broken when the judge announced that, given the new evidence, Mariana's position would be re-evaluated immediately, and that Helena could be called to account not only for defamation but also for financial crimes. The air grew heavy. The matriarch's downfall was only beginning. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of journalists had already transformed the case into a national spectacle. Broadcasters' screens broadcast every detail of the hearing live, and on social media, the name Helena Vasconcelos topped the list of most talked about topics. Headlines that until yesterday had called Mariana a thief now featured phrases like "Maid may be victim of $1 million scam" and "businessman's wife investigated for fraud." Public opinion was shifting in record time. People who had previously stood idly by in the face of injustice were now demonstrating in the streets, demanding justice for Mariana. She, however, still couldn't believe the turnaround. She felt relieved, but also frightened by the sudden exposure. Gabriel, by her side, tried to comprehend the scale of it all, but for him the most important thing was simple. The truth was beginning to prevail. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was a complete contrast to what it had been at the beginning of the trial. Mariana, who had previously sat cowering and humiliated, now received respectful looks, even from some who had previously judged her harshly. The judge ordered Mariana to be heard again, this time not as an accused, but as a witness to the entire trial. Her voice, firm despite her emotion, described years of dedication to the Vasconcelos family, the small gestures of affection toward Gabriel, and even Helena's constant contempt. Her every word seemed to restore not only her dignity, but also the audience's trust. Helena, sitting with her arms crossed and a rigid expression, barely concealed her anger at seeing the spotlight slip from her grasp. Ricardo avoided looking at her, biting his lip, aware that his omission had made him an indirect accomplice. When Mariana finished her testimony, the room erupted in murmurs of support. Some people even gave a discreet applause, a gesture quickly suppressed by the judge. But the effect was clear. For the first time, the truth had room to breathe. Helena, restless, whispered something in the ear of her lawyer, who stood to speak. In a voice thick with tension, he requested that some of the documents found be disregarded, claiming they were unrelated to the original watch case. The judge interrupted him curtly, saying that all of it was already under criminal review and that attempts to obstruct it could result in further penalties. The room fell into absolute silence. It was the first time Helena seemed truly trapped. However, there was still something hidden in the papers found in the safe, and when the investigators announced they had more revelations to present, the air in the courtroom grew unbearably heavy, as if everyone knew the worst was yet to come. The investigator opened one of the last envelopes removed from the safe and asked the judge's permission to read its contents aloud. When he began, absolute silence filled the room. They were forged contracts, signed in the name of employees of the mansion itself, indicating financial transactions that had never existed. Even more shocking was that the documents were directly linked to the names of former employees who, years earlier, had been accused of petty theft and humiliatingly fired. Mariana shuddered at this. Helena had repeated the same pattern of manipulation before, destroying innocent lives to maintain her image of power. The audience reacted with indignation. Journalists furiously took notes, and the murmurs grew like waves within the courtroom. Helena tried to stand up and interrupt the reading, but the judge ordered her to remain silent. Ricardo, this time, couldn't contain his reaction. He looked directly at his wife, with a mixture of anger and disbelief, and shook his head in denial. It was as if a lifelong trust had been broken in seconds. The family lawyer, lacking convincing arguments, simply asked for time, claiming he needed to verify the authenticity of the documents. But his expression betrayed the inevitable. He knew the situation was untenable. Mariana, overcome with emotion, looked at Gabriel and realized that, if it weren't for him, she might never have reached this point. The boy looked at her with a shy smile, proud to have been the voice of truth amidst so many lies. The judge, after hearing the full reading, declared that there was clear evidence of a recurring scheme of false accusations and manipulation within the Vasconcelos mansion. He said the case went beyond the clock accusation and that Helena could be indicted not only for defamation and slander, but also for document forgery, fraud, and moral harassment. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Helena, now maskless, was visibly trembling. Her eyes searched desperately for Ricardo, but he no longer defended her. On the contrary, he seemed ready to cooperate with justice. The atmosphere became unbearably tense until the judge announced that a formal criminal investigation against Helena would be opened immediately. At that moment, the noise of the journalists and the murmur of the audience echoed like a social sentence. The downfall of the most powerful woman in the city had only just begun. Ricardo had remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, but now, faced with the avalanche of evidence, he could no longer hide the weight of the truth. He slowly rose to his feet, the sound of his chair echoing in the room, and asked the judge to speak. The audience stirred. Journalists raised their cell phones to record every second, and Helena stared at him as if she could stop him with just a look. But Ricardo took a deep breath and began to speak. He admitted that he had trusted his wife blindly for years, allowing her to handle all family and business matters. He acknowledged that his silence in the face of the accusation against Mariana had been cowardly, and, with a choked voice, he said that this was not only a judicial failure, but also a moral one. "I failed as a leader, as a father, and as a man." The confession fell like a thunderclap in the room, leaving everyone in shock. Ricardo's words were like an extra sentence against Helena. Until that moment, many still expected him to stand by his wife, but his stance made it clear that trust had been irreversibly broken. He confirmed that, although he had no proof until then, he had always been suspicious of the way Helena treated her employees and managed her finances. He said that for years, he had closed his eyes because he believed that protecting the family's image was more important than seeking the truth. Mariana listened in silence, tears streaming down her face, feeling that someone powerful was finally acknowledging her innocence. Gabriel squeezed her hand tightly, proud of the moment. The audience reacted with subdued applause, and the judge had to call for order again. Such was the emotion that gripped the courtroom. Helena, on the other hand, was a wreck. Her eyes flashed with anger, but her hands trembled visibly. She tried to stand up and accuse Ricardo of treason, saying he was being manipulated by circumstances. But her voice no longer held any strength. It was merely the desperate echo of someone watching her empire of lies crumble. The judge ruled that, given the confessions and evidence presented, Helena would be officially investigated in a separate case, and that Mariana could no longer be treated as a defendant. The announcement was met with applause and discreet tears among those present. But, as everyone celebrated, Helena closed her eyes and murmured something barely audible to herself, a secret no one understood at that moment. The atmosphere of victory was interrupted by a strange tension. What Helena still harbored might not have been revealed. While the courtroom still vibrated with the announcement of the turnaround, Helena remained seated, her eyes half closed and her face rigid. Her lips moved discreetly, as if speaking only to herself, but those nearby heard fragments of her whisper. "They don't know everything. It's not over yet." The phrase echoed like a veiled threat, making even the judge momentarily uncomfortable. Mariana, already relieved by the change in position, shivered. It was as if Helena had prepared another move, something yet to be revealed. Journalists noticed the tension and began to speculate, recording every detail in their notebooks. Ricardo, for his part, frowned, trying to decipher whether those words were merely desperation or if they truly concealed something deeper. The air of victory began to give way to a strange apprehension. At that very moment, one of the investigators searching through the documents in the safe asked to speak. He revealed that he had found, among the pages of bank transfers and fake contracts, a letter sealed with the Vasconcelos family seal. The judge authorized the opening, and amid the absolute silence in the room, the paper was unfolded. The contents described detailed instructions for hiding valuables and even manipulating security camera footage from the mansion. The document was signed by someone unexpected, not Helena, but Ricardo. The shock was immediate. Mariana's eyes widened. Gabriel held his mother's hand tightly, and Helena, despite the humiliation, smiled bitterly. It was as if this revelation were her last weapon to drag everyone into the abyss with her. The judge stared at Ricardo, who froze. The room erupted in murmurs. If the signature were confirmed as genuine, the case could change course again, and Mariana would risk seeing the truth lost amid a new scandal. Helena, sensing the impact, lifted her chin and said aloud, "Did you think I was alone?" He always knew. The weight of the accusation hung over the room like an impending storm. Mariana, who until then had begun to regain her hope, felt the ground shake beneath her feet again. Gabriel looked at his father with wide eyes, confused and frightened. The judge called for absolute silence and ordered an immediate expert analysis of the letter, but the court was already in turmoil. What had seemed like a definitive victory had just turned into a new and dangerous enigma. The silence that fell over the room seemed heavier than any scream. All eyes turned to Ricardo, who remained motionless, his eyes wide as he stared at the letter. Mariana wasn't sure she could believe what she was seeing. Could it be that, after all the suffering, her own boss had been part of the plot? Gabriel, even more confused, squeezed his mother's hand, trying to find answers in her eyes. But Mariana was also lost. Ricardo tried to mumble something, but his voice failed. Helena seized the moment and, with an almost triumphant smile, loudly declared that this proved she wasn't solely responsible. She said that if she was going to fall, she would drag everyone down with her, including her own husband. The cameras recorded every second, and the journalists were already broadcasting the twist live, as if it were an unexpected chapter in a real-life soap opera. The judge, remaining firm, called for order and ordered the letter to be sent immediately for forensic analysis. The authenticity of the signature and the document needed to be confirmed. Meanwhile, Ricardo, trembling, asked to defend himself. With tears in his eyes, he declared that he had never signed anything of that nature, that it was a gross forgery to incriminate him and his wife. He said that, despite his mistakes of silence and cowardice, he would never have helped destroy Mariana's life. Some present believed the emotion in his voice, but others murmured suspiciously. Helena, with an air of false serenity, simply crossed her arms and let out an ironic laugh, as if she had delivered the final blow. Mariana watched in shock, unsure who to trust. As tensions mounted, investigators reported finding evidence of tampering with the letter, strange marks in the ink and subtle differences in the signature. The news brought a ray of hope to Mariana and even Ricardo, who breathed a sigh of relief. But the judge was clear. Until the forensic analysis was officially completed, nothing could be ruled out. Everyone's fate still hung in the balance. Helena, realizing her last card might not stand up to scrutiny, began to fidget in her chair. She knew that if the forgery was confirmed, there would be no escape. The entire courtroom waited in suspense, and Mariana, despite her fear, looked up at the judge. Something inside her told her the truth was finally about to explode, but no one could have predicted what would come to light with the next revelation. Hours later, the room filled again to hear the expert's report. The atmosphere was tense, with journalists fighting for every inch to capture the moment, and Mariana could barely breathe. She was so anxious. The expert entered with his briefcase in hand and handed the reports to the judge, who read them silently for a few seconds before looking up at the audience. "Ricardo Vasconcelos' signature is forged," he declared firmly. The confirmation fell like a bolt from the blue. Murmurs and exclamations echoed through the room. Ricardo let out a heavy sigh. bringing his hands to his face in relief and suppressed tears. Mariana hugged Gabriel tightly, feeling the truth was once again on her side. But all eyes soon turned to Helena, who remained motionless, her eyes fixed on nothing, as if unable to believe her latest move had failed. The judge continued reading, explaining that analysis of the ink and lines confirmed deliberate manipulation and that the letter had been recently forged. More than an attempt to confuse justice, this constituted direct obstruction of the process. Helena's lawyer tried to interrupt, urging caution and claiming that third parties could be involved, but the judge gave him no space. With each word read, Helena's image crumbled further in the public eye. People in the audience began to grow indignant, some even shouting for immediate punishment. Ricardo, standing up, faced his wife with a mixture of disappointment and pain, loudly declaring, "You tried to destroy the life of an innocent person, and now you're trying to destroy even mine." The cameras captured everything, and the sentence instantly reverberated on live broadcasts. Helena, feeling cornered as never before, finally broke the silence. In a fit of despair, she stood up and shouted that everyone was ungrateful, that no one understood the sacrifices she had made to keep her family afloat. She said she was being hunted like a criminal, when in reality she was only trying to protect the Vasconcelos name. But her words no longer carried weight. They sounded like the lament of someone who had completely lost control. The judge banged his gavel, announcing that she would now officially answer to new charges: forgery, obstruction of justice, and aggravated defamation. The entire courtroom vibrated, but Helena uttered one final sentence, a dark smile on her lips. "You have no idea what is yet to come." Silence fell over the courtroom once more. Mariana and Gabriel looked at each other apprehensively, realizing that this story still held one final, dangerous secret. Helena's words echoed like a dark threat, and the atmosphere of victory that had been building in the courtroom gave way to a suffocating tension. Everyone stared at her, waiting for her to say more, but Helena remained silent, simply staring at Mariana with a look of deep resentment. The judge, annoyed, ordered her restrained and reminded her that she was undergoing formal proceedings, but this only heightened everyone's curiosity. What could she still be hiding? The answer came minutes later, when one of the investigators lifted a final envelope found at the bottom of the safe. It was smaller, aged, and appeared to have been hidden there longer than the other documents. When opened, it revealed old letters and receipts mentioning suspicious payments to local authorities. Suddenly, the plot was no longer just a family dispute and transformed into something much larger, a possible corruption scheme involving people outside the Vasconcelos circle. Mariana, upon hearing the names mentioned in the letters, became even more confused. They were well-known politicians and business people from the region, respected figures who were apparently connected to Helena's schemes. Gabriel clutched her hand tightly, frightened, realizing that his mother, even though acquitted, was caught up in something far beyond her. Ricardo, shocked, put his hands to his head, as if finally comprehending the scale of everything he had ignored for years. Helena, seeing the general astonishment, laughed softly, a cold, lifeless laugh. She said that if she fell, she would take with her not only the maid she hated, but half the city's elite. The threat loomed like a bomb about to explode, and journalists were already reporting the news as a historic scandal that could shake the entire society. The judge, in a firm voice, declared that these new revelations expanded the case to areas beyond his immediate jurisdiction, demanding a federal investigation. The audience reacted with murmurs, and some even applauded the judge's courage. Mariana, however, felt a chill run down her spine. She had only wanted to clear her name, But now she found herself at the center of a power struggle involving far too many powerful people. Gabriel pressed his face against her shoulder and whispered that he wasn't afraid, but Mariana knew they weren't completely safe. Helena, handcuffed, looked up and said calmly, as if she still believed she was in control, "You've started something you won't be able to finish." The silence that followed was even heavier than the previous one, setting the stage for the inevitable outcome that was approaching. The court resumed with historic weight. Everyone knew that the case had already gone beyond a simple theft charge and become a symbol of something much greater. A simple woman's fight against manipulation, abuse of power, and entrenched corruption. Mariana stood before the judge, no longer as a defendant, but as someone who finally had a voice. With tears in her eyes but a firm voice, she thanked him for having been heard and said that all she wanted was to clear her name and return to live in peace with her son. Gabriel, sitting right behind her, looked on proudly, knowing that his courage had been the key that paved the way for the truth. The judge officially declared Mariana innocent of all charges, removed any connection between her name and the crime, and recognized her as a victim of defamation and persecution. The audience reacted with spontaneous applause, and journalists recorded every word as a milestone. Ricardo, deeply shaken, took the floor. With a choked voice, he confessed that he had failed as a leader and as a man, but promised to make amends. He said that from that day forward, he would do everything in his power to ensure that injustices like that never happened again. He asked Mariana and Gabriel for forgiveness directly, bowing before them in a gesture that surprised everyone. Mariana, overcome with emotion, didn't respond immediately, but her eyes held more compassion than resentment. For her, the true victory wasn't seeing Ricardo humiliated, but knowing that the truth had finally prevailed. Helena, handcuffed and defeated, was led out of the courtroom to shouts of justice from the audience. Her arrogance, which had previously made her seem untouchable, had transformed into a heavy silence and a blank stare. Outside, Mariana walked out hand in hand with Gabriel, greeted by a crowd that applauded and chanted her name. Journalists surrounded her, but for the first time, their questions weren't accusations, but rather requests to hear her side of the story. She spoke humbly, saying she didn't want revenge, only dignity. She said her greatest treasure was being able to look into her son's eyes and know he always believed her. Gabriel embraced her and, before the cameras, declared, "My mother never lied. She is innocent." The scene moved everyone, and the images traveled across the country within minutes, transforming Mariana into a symbol of resistance against injustice. As the sun set, she took a deep breath and smiled for the first time in a long time. The battle had been long and painful, but with Gabriel by her side, she felt she could finally begin anew. The truth had won, and peace, at last, had returned to her heart. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and share. This way, you'll help us bring you more moving stories that impact and transform lives. Thank you so much for your support.